Well, I'm back for part 2 of my week 7 video. And this is the paper 2 assignment sheet for English 1020. So for this second major paper of the course, I'll ask you to write an explication of a poem. So when you hear that fancy word explication, think explanation. That's a little more clear. And so an explication of a poem explains and interprets the poem in order to demonstrate a clear understanding and interpretation of its details, its underlying meaning, so therefore its themes, the techniques that the poet is using to produce meaning and content, and any other unique or important aspects of that poem. And a lot of the ideas that we just looked at in part 1 of my video for this week, The Elements of Poetry, can certainly be used, and that terminology would be helpful for you to use in earning a good grade on paper 2. So for this paper, you'll write a general explication or explanation of a poem that we're studying together in Unit 2 that develops a central idea as expressed in your thesis statement. And so again, if you're wondering, where is Unit 2? When is Unit 2? Well, we're just beginning it now, right? And your course syllabus is going to explain to you where the units begin and end. But Unit 2, we're beginning now, and then it ends on the day that paper 2 comes due. So here are the important dates that you need to keep in mind. Wednesday the 23rd will be our idea workshop for paper 2, and we'll conduct it much as we did with paper 1. I will give you an idea worksheet, questions that will encourage you to begin to think about how you're going to go about writing this paper, what your main points might be, your thesis, things of that nature. And so to get to the idea worksheet, you'll go to the assignments tab and you'll look for idea worksheet for paper 2. You'll follow the instructions there, and you need to type out your answers and submit them before 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday, March the 23rd. And then on Monday the 28th, we'll be engaging in our pre-writing process for paper 2. So we will not be doing an actual rough draft this time. I did that for you on paper 1 and commented extensively and even line edited. But now we're to the point where you need to be assuming greater responsibility for your writing. And so this time around, rather than having a rough draft and peer review, we're having this pre-writing process that we'll engage in. So you want to submit a pre-written introductory paragraph with a thesis as the last sentence of that paragraph, and an informal outline. It doesn't have to be fancy or long. Just informal with at least 3 main points that you're going to discuss in your paper, and certainly you can have more. And so you'll submit that into the discussion board. That will also count as a discussion board activity, and you'll do that before 11:59 p.m. on Monday night, the 28th of March. And so you'll go to discussions, you'll look for the week 11 pre-writing for paper 2 discussion board, and then I will actually come back and comment on your pre-written introductory paragraph, your thesis, the main points in your outline, etc. So not going to line edit, not going to do anything like that, but I will comment on all of that. And it's a good idea to go back and look at my comments on the rough and final drafts of paper 1, just to see what errors you were making and to avoid, making those again. So remember, this is part of the writing process, this pre-writing day. So the policy of that 10 points being deducted from your paper 2 grade will apply if you do not submit your pre-writing material by the deadline. And then on Monday, the 4th of April, the final draft of paper 2 is due no later than 11:59 p.m. So after you've looked at my feedback that I provide on your pre-writing, your intro, your thesis, your outline, then submit your final draft. So make sure that you look at my feedback. because it might really help you to earn a higher grade. And make sure that you enact the suggestions that I offer to you on my feedback for your pre-writing material. So when you submit the final draft, go to assignments and look for paper 2 final draft. And remember that policy that is reiterated on the course syllabus, in the weekly checklist, and announcements, etc. 10 points are deducted from your paper 2 grade for every calendar day your paper is late. That includes the day it's due and weekends if they fall within that time frame. Papers are not accepted after 5 days because they would be automatic Fs. So specifics, again, as with paper 1, this one should be at least 3 full pages of written material. So if you're under 3 full pages, you're going to get some points docked. If you submit half a paper, you'll receive half a grade, and that's a 50, and that's an F. And so obviously typed, double spaced, Times New Roman 12-point font, standard margins. For this assignment, again, you only need to document your main source, the poem that you're analyzing. However, I strongly recommend and encourage to you to add a second source, okay? That either offers some sort of literary critique of the poem you're writing about, or that comments on a technique that you're seeing at work within this piece. So for example, if you're writing about a particular poem that's using a lot of alliteration or metaphor, you could include a source that talks about metaphor or alliteration and defines it and explains it, and then further comment on how that's used in this poem. But it's a good idea to actually go to the library databases or use the little Ask a Librarian tab and a chat with a librarian in real time and find a source that comments on your poem specifically. It needs to be reliable. It doesn't have to be scholarly, but it should be reliable. And you'll need to incorporate the quotations, the line quotations, and if you paraphrase too, be sure you cite both within the body of your paper, and then you need that separate works cited sheet that will be at the very end of your paper. So at least 3 full pages of writing and the works cited sheet. If you go over 3, that's fine, but you need to have at least 3. So your goal in this paper is to write a careful explication of a poem of your choosing, as long as it is one excuse me, that is listed on your syllabus in Unit 2. And I give you the dates here. Unit 2 begins Monday, the 1st of March. It ends on the day that paper 2 is due. So any poem that's listed on the syllabus there is fair game. And notice when you're choosing your poem, every technique that the poet has used. Look back at that Elements of Poetry sheet that we just reviewed in part 1. Look back at my video if you need further help. And also pay careful attention to and address matters like symbolism, like sound and rhythm, like internal and external structure. And we'll be talking about, as I said in my part 1 video, structure in our discussion boards. And then finally, at some point in your paper, this isn't the main focus of it, but at some point, add a paragraph that addresses the way in which this poem reveals some aspect of our class theme, which is enslavement. So to be successful here, you should be thinking about the following ideas and making sure you're on track. Have I chosen a poem listed in Unit 2 of our syllabus? If it's not listed there, then it's not fair game, and I can't accept your paper. So make sure it's on the syllabus. The weekly checklist also gives you all those titles. Have I written a compelling thesis statement? So for example, your thesis should say something more meaningful than the poem Why Do We Sing by Mario Benedetti is very beautiful. So that's too broad. Why is it beautiful and how is it beautiful? Beautiful is a vague word. Be clear on what it is about this poem that provides beauty, right? Be specific about it. And by the way, notice in that quote, the poem, Why Do We Sing? Look at the title, Why Do We Sing? Notice that it has little individual marks surrounding it, almost like apostrophe marks. So if you didn't learn this in 1010, it's important that you learn it now. When you have a quote inside another quote, and we know that the titles of poems are always placed in quotation marks, you put the inner quote using these little single lines, and you put normal double quotation marks around the entire thing. So that's just a good technique for you to know. Then make sure you check your topic sentences and remember what those are. Those are the very first sentence in each paragraph, and they generally tell your reader, here's what this paragraph's going to be about. Here's what I'm talking about now. And sometimes they act like a link in a chain. They'll look back at what you just said and look ahead to what you're talking about now. So have I checked my topic sentences to be sure I'm making points of analysis, of explanation, rather than just summarizing the poem? So this is not a summary. This is an explication. It's an analysis of that poem. So, for example, next the narrator states the people sing because cruelty has no name. And then in your next paragraph, next he says they sing because of the child. So that's all well and good if you go on into depth and explain the techniques that the writer is using, and maybe the theme, how the poem is revealing a theme or something deeper. But if all you're doing is just giving us a plot summary of what happens in the poem, then that's not going to be enough. That's not adhering to the assignment. And so we need an explication, an explanation of matters like techniques used and theme, structure, things like that. Does your introductory paragraph have a hook? So we need a sentence that sort of makes your reader want to keep reading. And we've talked about that before. So it could be maybe a fact that's interesting. It could be maybe a question, but don't use you in it. Don't use second person. This is formal academic writing. We don't use first or second person unless those words are part of a quote. And so after that hook, then we also need to see in your intro the title of the work, correctly punctuated in quotation marks, the full name of the author, the reason the poem has meaning, and finally your thesis statement as the last sentence or two of your intro. Remember, poetry titles are placed in quotations. The only time that will be different is if it's a super duper long poem, and then it will be italicized. But the rule is shorter works, the titles are in quotations. Longer works, they're italicized. And poems are almost always very short works. Remember to refer to the author by last name only after you introduce him or her fully in your introductory paragraph. That's standard protocol for college level writing in all classes. So if you're in a science class and you're writing about Albert Einstein, in your intro you'll call him Albert Einstein, but after that you'll call him Einstein. You won't call him Albert, you won't call him Mr. Einstein, you won't call him my good buddy Al, right? It's Einstein. That makes you sound like a college writer. Make sure you use literary present tense. And so if you struggled with that in paper 1, go back and look at my comments on your graded draft of that paper. So again, remember the basic idea here. Literature can be read again and again, right? And so we might be reading a work that was written 500 years ago. Someone might read a work we write now 500 years from now. So the characters and the stories always perpetually exist, right? And therefore we use present tense when we're referring to actions and characters within a work. So for example, Benedetti uses, and now the author may be long dead, but we're not going to say used. Benedetti uses interesting sentence structure to explain the reasons for the tenacity and courage of his people. His use of unfinished sentences mirrors his open-ended sense of hope for a future filled with possibilities. So we didn't say used and we didn't say mirrored past tense. We stayed in literary present tense. Make sure you're using formal academic language, so no first or second person, no I or me or you or yours, unless those words are part of a quote that you're using. No words like stuff and thing and people, if you can avoid it. Tell us specifically who the people are and what the thing is. Good writing is about specificity. Make sure your in-text citations are there and that they're correct. And remember, it's different when you're quoting poetry because you do not use page numbers, rather you use line numbers. And you may have to actually count down to the line that you're quoting. Is it line 4? Is it line 8? What is it? You know, are you quoting line 4-8, 4 through 8? And so in your in-text citation, you'll have the quote from the poem, no period at the end of the quote. That's not the way it works. That's not the end of your sentence. Then your beginning parenthesis mark, the writer's last name, and the first time you quote from the poem, you'll put a comma and then line 4 or whatever it is. Or if you're quoting more than one line, lines 4-8, then the end parenthesis, then the period. After that, you do not need to have the comma and you do not need to have the word line. You can just say Benedetti 4, Benedetti 4-8, right? So bear that in mind. And then you need that separate works cited page correctly formatted in MLA. Use your Little Seagull handbook. Use the resources I provided for you here on our course page under content, MLA, help. Remember that when you quote from a poem, you need to use diagonal marks, and I've shown you here, to indicate where the lines in the poems are separated from one another. So if I were quoting from Roses Are Red, I'd say, the poet uses rhyme in the following line, colon, quote, roses are red, space, diagonal space. Violets are blue, space, diagonal space. Sugar is sweet, space, diagonal space. And so are you, end quote. And then I'd have my parenthesis with the writer's last name and the line numbers, right? Make sure that you do not plagiarize. You need to document and cite every time you quote, every time you paraphrase within your paper. And then make sure you're including those quotes. If you write a paper and there are no quotes in it, your paper cannot pass. If you write paper 2 and there are no in-text citations and there's no works cited sheet, your paper is probably not going to pass. So make sure that you include the quotes and that you incorporate them by introducing them with wording of your own. So remember the golden rule. Anytime a quote appears by itself as a sentence in your paper, you have dropped it. It is not incorporated, and points are deducted from your grade. So here's an example. Benedetti repeatedly poses the rhetorical question of why the Uruguayan people sing despite the desperation of their motherland's political struggles, colon, quote, if those who are ours are left without an embrace, space, diagonal space, our motherland is almost dead of sadness, space, diagonal space, and the heart of man is blown to pieces, space, diagonal space. Before shame exploded, space, diagonal space, you will ask, why do we sing, end quote. And then in parentheses, the line numbers, end parentheses, and then your period, because that's the end of your sentence now. Now, why did we not have to put Benedetti's last name in our in-text citation? Well, that's because we mentioned his name in our attribution, in our sentence that is part of that quote. So if we had not mentioned his name, if we had said the author repeatedly poses the question, then in our in-text citation, we would have had to say Benedetti, and then the line numbers. So you see how those diagonals look, and that's marking where that line ends and the next line begins. And by the way, note that often in poetry, people initially have this idea that a thought is going to end where the line ends. Not true. The thought may continue on into the next line and the next and the next. It may be one long continuous sentence or thought throughout the entire poem. So don't necessarily try to imagine that a thought ends at the end of a line, rather think about where the sentence would end, because it may go on into the next line and even into the next and so on. Make sure you have a fully developed intro, body, and conclusion. Answer the questions at some point in your paper. So what? Who cares? So, think like your reader. Why would we care about this poem? So what about it, right? What makes it special? Make sure you include an analysis of the poet's language, so the word choices, the connotative meaning of the words, how they may be acting as images, so the use of imagery, as symbols, and an analysis of the rhythm, the tone, the style, any other important techniques. And again, that elements of poetry sheet and that video will be really helpful. Make sure that you make a connection at some point within your essay regarding the way in which the idea of enslavement is expressed in the poem. Now, that's not the main goal of this paper, but because it's our class theme, you can certainly add a little section. So now I give you examples of a possible thesis and game plan for paper 2. So I'm using the Mario Benedetti poem where we're not reading it together, but I'm using it as an example. In Mario Benedetti's moving poem, Why Do We Sing?, the poet poses the rhetorical question of why the Uruguayan people may continue to sing despite the hardships they've undergone. The second half of the poem proceeds to answer the question, offering multiple varied reasons for the ongoing song of the people. After a careful explication of Benedetti's poem, and this is the actual thesis, analyzing the imagery used along with the denotations and connotations of the poet's language, one may argue that the poet uses the concept of singing as a metaphor for his people's resilience and endurance. So this thesis talks about imagery, it talks about connotative meaning, and it says, you know what, the poet uses this idea of singing as a metaphor throughout the poem. So basically this poem is an analogy. The entire poem is a metaphor. So for this kind of thesis, you've got to carefully consider every word of the poem. What are the literal meanings? What are the figurative, connotative meanings lying underneath the literal meanings? And you want to write about that. You want to devote a section to that. How do the analogies compare to each other? How are they similar? How are they different? And then you want to consider things like rhythm and rhyme and sound and tone as you are looking at the poem. You want to follow the points that you lay out in your thesis. Now, that doesn't mean you can't talk about other ideas as well, but you want to follow the main point of imagery, connotative meaning, and that metaphor that runs throughout the poem and how it's working. So here's another example using a poem that we are actually reading together. Martin Espada's lyrical poem. So right off the bat, this writer is telling us what kind of form the poem is taking. It's lyrical, meaning it's focusing on the writer's or the narrator's emotions and state of mind. Of the threads that connect the stars begins with a question posed by a father to his son. Did you ever see stars? Now again, we have one, that's line 1, because we've already mentioned Espada's name. And ideally, since this is the first time that the person might be quoting from the poem, it should say line 1. And then after that, you don't need the word line or lines, but you're just establishing with your reader right off the bat, I'm quoting from lines, not from a page number. While the reader initially expects the poem's subject matter to focus on heavenly stars, one quickly grasps the fact that instead, the speaker initially refers to the stars one sees when being hit hard in the face during a fist fight. Now, see how we're using one instead of you? We didn't say on the stars you see, on the stars one sees. This elevates our language. This makes us seem like college-level writers. As the poem continues, Espada metaphorically connects 3 generations of Puerto Rican American men following their journey to become Americanized. A thorough explication of this work, notice how the writer uses the word explication, the writer is using the terminology that we're learning, reveals the family's ascent through the generations from that of the grandfather, a struggling immigrant in Brooklyn, to the speaker's own son, a young astronomer who now sees stars in a new and significant way. So to create an effective paper from this kind of thesis and intro, you would need to demonstrate, again through line quotes and or paraphrases, but well, you got to have quotes, how the use of the word stars is setting up this whole metaphorical journey of the family's experience and history in the poem. So again, you've got to consider every word. You know, what does it literally mean, but what are the connotative meanings? Look carefully at the symbolism within the poem. So is it universal? Is this idea of stars, as representing something else, is that something most everyone would grasp? Is some of it cultural? Is some of it contextual, sort of taking place within a certain area at a certain time? Or could it be all of the above in different spots in the poem? So how, for example, does the symbol of the stars connect with the idea of the stars and stripes in the American flag? Consider the emotions inherent in the language. What larger meanings and implications is the poem setting forth regarding the challenges that are faced by immigrant families? So that's paper 2. We'll be going into depth about a lot of these ideas in our discussion boards and through sample papers that you'll be able to look at. And you see at the bottom of the paper the Tennessee Board of Regents student learning outcomes to be evaluated, and there's a separate sheet, as always, that explains those learning outcomes to you if you would like to look at it. So thanks so much for your patience. See you next time.